So to animate things, all you do is select the object you want to animate and press F. This inserts a keyframe down here in our dope sheet animation area. And it also moves our time indicator, that's this little orange cursor thing, it moves this down 1 second. Down here, this 0, 1, 2, 3, 4, this is our timeline displayed in seconds. If you prefer to have this display in actual frames, you can come here and select view and turn off show seconds. I typically find it really helpful to have this display in time units because I'm a human and I'm familiar with what 1 second or 5 seconds is, as opposed to trying to force my brain to be able to assimilate an understanding of time based on individual frames. There's times when you need this, but in general, it's more helpful to have this display in a recognizable way. So we'll turn this back on to show seconds here. And so we can see that this is the object being animated because it says cube here. Also over here in the outliner, here's this cube highlighted. So when we pressed F, it inserted a keyframe. It moved the timeline down 1 second, as we can see. So this is a second later. So now we have to decide, okay, how does this cube look a second later? Because then Blender will figure out how to display all the frames between frame 0 and 1 second later, which is actually 30 frames. And I know that this is 30 frames because down here where it says FPS, this is set to 30. And this is basically how fast the animation will play back, and consequently how many frames are in each second, which we can change this whenever we want. Okay, so 30 frames later, 1 second later, what should this do? So when we're talking about animating basic objects such as a cube or any other kind of basic mesh, there's really only 3 ways that we can animate the basic object. There's a bunch of other ways to animate things with shape keys and armatures and stuff like that. But when we're talking about animating these basic objects, we're really talking about how do they transform. That is, how does it scale, rotate, or translate, which basically means move. So one of these 3 ways, or any mixture of those 3 ways. So I'll right click to cancel that movement. So we could press G to grab and move this over here. And we could press F to insert a keyframe again. So if we come down here and we press our back button on our little play controls to bring the frame all the way back to frame 0, and we press play, we'll see the cube animate. So we could right mouse click, or you could hold middle mouse if you're using your tablet, and let go of the cursor anywhere near a keyframe, and it will automatically snap to that keyframe. And we could change this. So say we decided, you know what, at this particular keyframe, and we know that we're precisely on this keyframe and not a little bit off or something because this is highlighted here. So say we instead we wanted it over here, we could press G to grab, move it over here, press F again, and now that keyframe's been overwritten. So we could move it back there, let it snap to that, and move it somewhere else. We could scale it like this. We could rotate it, something like that, and press F again, and that will overwrite that keyframe. And if I just drag this back with my right mouse button, or you can just press back to go all the way back here and press play, we'll see Blender animate this for us between these 2 keyframes. So notice right now that these keyframes are yellow, and I'll right click to drag my time indicator over here so we can see these better. Notice they're yellow. That means that they are selected, but we can press A and this will toggle select all. So if we press A again, it will select all of them, or we can just left click on individual keyframes to highlight and select them. So I'm going to push this all the way back and press A. Well, actually A again to select all, and press X to delete all those keyframes. I'm going to just really quickly animate and transform this cube in some wacky ways. So I'll press F to insert a keyframe, S to scale. I'm just going to do a bunch of random transforms here. Maybe S to scale, middle mouse to constrain to get it to scale vertically. Maybe G to grab, move it over here, press F to insert another keyframe. R to rotate, middle mouse to constrain to get it to spin around the X axis, hold Control to snap to precise angles there, maybe scale it back down, press F, And if you're following along, you don't have to do it exactly like this. Just by using G to grab, R to rotate, and S to scale, just move this around a bunch. And every time after you change it, just press F, and that will insert a keyframe for us and move our timeline down. Press G to grab, move it over here, S to scale. And I'm not doing anything specific, just we're trying to, just get some movement on the screen. Press F again. Okay, so I've got these 5 keyframes here, and if we press back here and press play, here is this cube all animated and whatnot. So one thing I usually like to do when I'm plotting out a basic animation like this is go ahead and have the object that I'm animating selected, and down here under camera, if we press follow selected, then the camera will now follow our animation. So if I press back and then press play, I have the camera following the animation down here, and this is just another nice visual aid while you're doing this stuff. Okay, so we can speed up or slow down our overall animation by scaling it. You scale your keyframes in the same way you scale your objects by just pressing S. So the keyframes you want to scale, of course, you have them selected. You can do that by selecting and shift selecting the ones you want to scale, or if you want to select all of them, you can press A to toggle all. Or you can, in the same way you can press B to do a border select here in the 3D view, you can press B to do a border select in the timeline as well. So it's important to note that the keyframes will scale towards wherever the cursor happens to be. So for instance, if we were to drag it over here and let go and let it snap to this end keyframe and press S to scale, they're all going to scale towards the cursor there. So I'll right click to cancel that action I was doing, as we like to do here in Blender, and then I'll drag this down to 0. So right now this little animation is 4 seconds long. If we wanted to speed it up by 2, then we could press S to scale and move this down to 2 seconds here. So now if we press play, this happens in half the time and thus, much faster. Or if we wanted to slow it down, it was at 4 seconds, we could press S to scale and bring this to 8. And that would be the equivalent of slowing it down by 2 times. So we're much slower. Press pause and go back here. So if we were to adjust the frames per second, either to less or more, this is also going to change the total length of time the animation will take. But this isn't really the way you want to slow down or speed up your animation, because you want to have a consistent frame rate when you're creating something. But so if we were to slow this down to something real crazy like 5 frames per second, which would be extremely slow, you can see even down here down in the timeline, now the space between these 2 keyframes is over 10 seconds. So if I were to press play, it's going at this incredibly slow rate here. So we'll pause, go back here, or we could speed this up to say twice the speed, which would be 60 frames per second, and press play. And look how smooth and buttery that is. Very nice to look at. So you always want to adjust your frames per second for whatever you have planned for your project, but typically you're going to want to keep the frames per second the same throughout the whole project. Make sure you have that figured out ahead of time before you get started animating on anything serious. And just remember that if you really want to slow down or speed up a part of an animation, what you're really looking to adjust is these keyframes. So I'll click this and put it back to 30 frames per second. Say for instance that I decided that I like the speed between here and here, but I really want this last part to speed up. What I should do is drag my time indicator to the point where I want things to start speeding up, and then press B to do a border select to select everything after that, and then press S to scale, and I could scale this down by a few seconds, and that will make it go much faster towards the end there. So we could have this really slow starting out animation bit, and then it zooms up really quick towards the end when we scale these frames together. So what this little bottom area is actually a merger of Blender's timeline and Blender's dope sheet editor. You can change any Windows editor type by clicking on this icon at the far left corner of most of these header menus, which we've discussed in the past, that these header menus can be at the bottom of a window or at the top, but they're still called header menus. So this one happens to be at the bottom, and they can also be hidden. You can click and drag them, so you'll see some of them hidden across the interface. If you want to get them back, you press the little plus sign. But anyway, if we click here and switch this to the default dope sheet editor, here is half of what this is down here. And so the dope sheet is where we can adjust our keyframes and stuff like that for animation. And then the other half of what this thing down here is the timeline. And so the timeline allows us to play our animation back and set all these kind of things. So I'll switch this back to the 3D view. So what this is down here is a custom menu designed especially for Sensei format to bring those two editor types together to create a more easy to use kind of animation overall interface, such as the likes of Flash or After Effects or something like that. So what is it that all this stuff does? All right, real quickly. At the far left here, we have this little key symbol and it says Locrot sk. It actually says scale if we could see the whole thing. This is actually a menu which decides what happens when we press F to insert a keyframe or when we press I to insert a keyframe. So we've learned that we can insert a keyframe and move the timeline down a second by pressing F, which is a really awesome way to quickly hammer out a basic animation that you can start working with and editing and stuff. But you can also just insert a keyframe by pressing I. So say for instance I right click and move the timeline cursor to 6.5 seconds here, and I say I wanted this over here and to scale it or something or rotate it. If I press F, this will insert a keyframe and move this down a second. Or you can also just press I, and this will insert a keyframe without moving the timeline. But anyway, when you either press I or F to insert a keyframe, what happens is whatever is selected on here will be the type of keyframes that are entered. So if we click here, we have all these different options. 100% of the time, I never use anything but location, rotation, scale, which is basically means everything. It means put in a keyframe for anything I might possibly need. I don't want to have to make a decision about this shit every time I insert a keyframe. So that's why we typically leave this on location, rotation, scale. But there are some technical situations that you may come across in the future where you want to explore some of these other options for entering in keyframes for things. But typically we, just leave this on location, rotation, scale, and that covers all our basis for creating these keyframes. So next up here we have this little blank button, which if we click this just gives us quick access to our interpolation types. So we're going to save discussing this for another video because there's a lot to cover here. But basically this allows you to adjust whatever keyframes you have selected over here. So we have these from here to here, these 4 keyframes selected. This allows you to adjust the way that these are animated. So say for instance I were to add this elastic effect to these keyframes and bring these back and press play. You see that whenever the indicator gets to the frame, it shakes the object around like Jello, which is really sweet. So there's a lot of awesome stuff we can do with these, so we're going to save that for another video. But moving on to the right here, we have this very obvious, ominous record button here. And what this will do is whenever you move the timeline, rather than having to press F or I to insert a keyframe, as soon as you make a change to that object, if this is pressed, it will be recorded as a keyframe. For instance, if I were to right mouse click to drag the timeline down here, so say I were to make a change to this right now, say I were to press R to rotate this around, maybe scale it down super small. I made that change, but a keyframe won't be entered and it won't be remembered for the animation when we press play unless I press F or I right now. So I changed it, but because I didn't press F or I to insert a keyframe, it's not remembered at all. That change doesn't happen. So if we're doing a lot of this, we could press this to do the auto record, and then whatever change we made, so if we scale this down super small, notice the keyframe gets immediately added. So then we can just move the timeline around, rotate stuff, whatever, and these changes are saved and added as keyframes to our animation. So I'll go ahead and shut that off for now. And here we have our playback controls. So we have the back button, which will take us to the beginning of the animation. We have the end button, which will take us to the last frame of the animation. These are special Sensei format controls, so if you're used to using Blender, you might notice a difference between the functionality of these. They've been enhanced. Right next to this, we have this back button here, and this will travel from keyframe to keyframe. And so if we keep pressing it, or either forward or backward, it will take us from frame to frame, and if there are no more keyframes, it will then snap to increments of half a second. So it's useful in that way. To the right of this, we have start and end, and this decides where our animation should start and where it should end. So right now it starts at 0, but I could just as easily say, drag my timeline to the second frame. I see this is at frame 60 here. I could have it start at this point, so I could change this from 0 and enter 60 here. Now, no matter what frame I'm on, so I could be, at frame 15 or something, if I press play, it's going to immediately start at frame 60. And if I were to render out my animation by coming here and pressing render animation, it would render between 60 to frame 600 right now, which is way down there. So say I wanted this to start at frame 0 and end at the last frame of my animation here, which is frame 195, which you can also see here. So we could click this and press 195. Now the animation link that just covers the beginning and end of where my keyframes actually start and end for this, specific object here. So there are times when you may have a big chunk of animation that you're working on. So say this was 600 frames long, and say I had like other kinds of stuff animated way down here and whatnot, but you're really interested in focusing on working on just a certain area of the animation, and you want it to loop over and over while you're animating or testing and stuff. And for that, we use this button here. If we click it, we'll see the left and to the right get kind of darkened out here. Let's say I wanted to just focus on, let's see, frame 4, which is 120. We can note that here or here to frame 195. We could change these values to 120 and then the end value to 195. Or of course you can just click and drag these if you want to do it in a visual way, may be helpful for you. Just, drag this to about the area where you need this to loop. Now if we press play, the animation is just going to play over the area where we have our little temporary timeline thingy. And this is useful so you don't have to change the start and end of the animation every time you want to just focus in on an area. And then so if you want to switch back to the regular timeline, you just click this and it's back to normal. So we could press play and it's gonna, follow the whole shebang there. And if we need it back, we just click and it's there to focus on whatever area we want to focus on. So I'll go ahead and turn that off. So to the right of that, we have frames per second, which we already talked about. We can actually adjust this FPS on the fly when we're animating if we want to create keyframes that are closer together or farther apart. So say I were to right click and drag my time indicator to the last frame here. So right now, if I were to press F, this is going to insert keyframes that are 1 second apart. But if I press Control Z to undo all that, and we'll start this back off at 7 here. So say I wanted to make these much closer together, I could drop this down to say 5 frames per second, and I could press F here, press S to scale, press F, rotate this, and see how these keyframes are much closer now. It's just kind of a cheap trick, cool way to adjust the distance between these auto keyframing system we have set up here. So if we switch this back to 30, the frames per second are back to normal, but what we have left over is a bunch of frames more closely animated together, which will, go faster, which was the goal. See, so they're just moving around all crazy there. Or for instance, if we wanted it to be longer than a second, we could speed this up to 60, and then this would put 2 seconds between each frame we enter if we're using the F keyframe entry method. So if I were to press F here, and then S to scale, G to grab, R to rotate, whatever I actually wanted to do with this thing, press F here, and then switch this back to our standard frames per second that we planned on using for our whole project or whatever, what we're left with is a cool way to get a little more control on the spacing between keyframes when we're using the F method of entering them. So this button in between here, this gives us control over our cursor snapping settings. So if I click this, we can either disable timeline snap altogether, or we can change the increment from which it will snap to. So right now it's set on half second. So here's second 13 and here's second 14. If I right click or middle mouse click to drag my timeline, notice that when I let go of it, it's going to snap to either a whole second or a half second. Or say I were to scale these frames here and, get them off of the actual grid they're on, it will snap to whatever keyframe it's closest to. But if there's no keyframes around, it's going to snap to the increment of the grid. Now, when you start getting to smaller frames like this, it can sometimes have a little bit of trouble, picking which one, deciding which one it wants to snap to. And if that's the case, you can decrease the snap increment, so to really low, something like this, and that way the snapping will be a bit more precise. You can also just totally disable it if you want to. If you click here and press disable timeline snap, this will be the default way it works and it won't snap to any keyframes. Or what I like to do is keep it enabled because it's very useful most of the time. And also, I'll increase this back to a half second where it is by default. You can just hold Alt and then right mouse click or middle mouse click, and this will disable it temporarily. So if it's being finicky, you can just hold Alt and right mouse click to temporarily disable that, and then just go back to regular clicking, which is very useful. So another awesome Sensei format feature is that the keyframes will automatically snap to your timeline. So if I were to move my cursor over here and press G to grab this selection of keyframes, wherever I let go of this selection of keyframes, the whole thing will snap to the cursor where the closest keyframe is. So if we wanted it to the beginning or we wanted it to do it to the end, it's going to snap like that for us. So I'm going to right click and drag my cursor back to here, press G to grab the selection of keyframes and just let go near the cursor and they will snap to it. You hear me calling this cursor. It's sometimes called a cursor, sometimes called a time indicator. It's just the orange line which represents what current frame you're on, basically. We've covered a lot of information in this video, and I don't want to give you too much information overload. Everything to the right of this current frame you're on, which is 90. You can also use this to adjust the timeline, so you could just, if you want to manually move it down 1 or 2 frames to the left or right without snapping, you can also do it that way. So everything to the right of this is just default dope sheet stuff. So if we were to change this editor type to the dope sheet editor, this is all default stuff in here. You'll notice that instead of where it says view, select, marker, channel, key here, that this menu bit has been collapsed. And so if we were to right click on this and under header, press collapse menus, you'll see it expand. And this is just to help us clean up this interface a little bit. Let's right click and turn that back on. But if you need to get to any of these items within the dope sheet, it's just a quick way to select them via this menu rather than like that. So I'll switch this back to the 3D view. Yeah, we've covered a lot, so I'm not going to really go over this stuff right now. However, be aware that there are some very useful menus in here, such as the key menu, which we can use to do all sorts of things. Also set markers, which we'll get into that in the future. And another thing, up until now, we've only had one object animated here, this cube. But say I were to right click over here and add a monkey, tap W a few times to give it some smoothing, and go back to frame 0 here. Say I were to press F to insert a keyframe for this monkey Suzanne head, you'll see it immediately pop up next to cube. And I could press S to scale, R to rotate, G to grab, press F, and just give it some random animation-y stuff. Okay, so right now we've got 2 objects being displayed and we can see and adjust all their keyframes and all this stuff. A lot of times you're going to need to be able to animate something in regards to something else. So say I know this cube keyframe is right here and the Suzanne monkey head keyframe is right here, and I say I want this to be like going over that, then I would be able to adjust that, press F, insert a keyframe, and what have you. But if you ever want to single this out to just one object's animation keyframes, you can press this button right here, and this will only display whatever object you have selected, or all the objects you have selected if you got a bunch of stuff going on. So we've nearly finished the gauntlet of this basic animation video. I know it's been a lot of info, but before we go, let's press T to bring up our tool shelf. And under this animation tab, we've got some things here. We've got Blender's default animation menu options here. So say instead of pressing I or F, you wanted to manually insert a keyframe, you can do that here. Stuff on motion paths, which we'll get into in the future, and baking actions, which is sort of similar to baking physics simulations, which we discussed in our physics video. But I'll go ahead and close this up. What we're going to talk about real quick before we go is these extended tools, which allow us to edit our keyframes in some helpful ways. So if I select this cube here, so here on the cubes animation here, I'm going to go ahead and select some of these and scale them, just so I can get this animation to be a little closer together. And something like that. Okay. So I've got, this animation of this cube going all crazy, and there's where it starts jiggling and wobbling and moving really fast where we had the frames close together. So any frames I want to reverse, I just select them. So say for instance, if I were to B to do a border select, and we've got this, small selection from here. Here's this first keyframe, and it looks like that. And here is the last keyframe, and it looks like that. If I wanted to reverse these, I just select them, press reverse. This is now where that was and vice versa. So if I were to press play, I've reversed that. My time indicator was at this line here, but it doesn't have to be in any special location. So my time indicator could be here or anywhere, it doesn't matter. Just whatever items you select, if you press reverse, they'll be reversed, or you can switch them back. And then next to that, we can mirror. So say I wanted to mirror these keyframes exactly. I just press B to do a border select of whatever keyframes I want to be mirrored. And it doesn't matter where my time indicator is. If I press mirror, they're going to be mirrored exactly around that frame. So notice this selection is identical and reversed to this selection, so it's perfectly mirrored. See, so if I stop this here, here's where that frame ends, and then here's where the other mirrored side is, and see they're exactly the same. Under here we have our chain select option, and this is really useful for cleaning up really large animation files that say where they've been hand animated frame by frame, or say you have a motion capture file, a .bvh file, and it's got just frame by frame animation, but it's too complicated and messy. Like for instance here, we've got a lot of these really close together keyframes. Maybe we just want to thin it out a little bit. We can use chain select to do that. So if I were to set this to 1 and then press chain select, notice that this will select frames, and this value controls how many frames should be skipped when selecting them. So it selects this one, skips one, select this one, skips one, and just goes along. From there, we could press delete, or we could invert that selection there. Say we wanted a selection to only be made once every 4 frames. If we press chain select again, notice that it will select the first frame and then skip 1, 2, 3, 4, select that one, skip 1, 2, 3, 4, select that one, and so on. So if we wanted to invert that, we can invert that selection. So we could delete those, and then we would thin out this animation. So it's really useful when you're dealing with kind of messy files. It's a nice cleanup tool. So that about covers it for now. I hope you've enjoyed this basic introduction to animation. I know it was a lot of stuff. We've still got a ton of stuff to cover, but once you start playing around with this stuff, it really becomes intuitive and not that hard to remember. So go back and rewatch this video if you need to, and make sure you try all this stuff out, because it is a pathway to a lot of fun.